Witches. Before Harry Potter hit the scene and made being a witch the coolest career choice I will never get to make, witches were not very popular. As in, there were a lot of executions, some of the most famous occurring during the Salem Witch Trials, which left over 20 people dead in about a year. But what could have caused this tragedy? Magic? Mania? Or was it one really bad drug trip? Hello, welcome to Nerdy and Quirky. Here's some cool history. So let's talk about context, because it is a massive player in this event. On a large political scale, the trials took place in the 17th century, which means pre-revolutionary America. The thing you need to know about the colonies is that they were a mess. Just imagine if you had a drunk toddler design a political system. Needless to say, there was a severe lack of judicial regulation. On a smaller scale, the events were focused in a cluster of small towns, fueled by their own rivalries and land disputes. And religiously, the region was composed of religious refugees who weren't really into a separation of church and state. And superstitiously, witch hunts were all the rage. Europe was hunting witches every decade or so, and that anxiety had spread to New England, primarily through Cotton Mather. He was a pamphleteer who believed that witches were
among the poor and vile and ragged beggars upon the earth.
So Salem was a powder keg, and in January of 1692, it exploded. The daughter and niece of Salem's local minister began to exhibit strange symptoms. They had violent convulsions beyond the power of epileptic fits, and they had loud outbursts. So they were diagnosed with bewitchment, which is an actual diagnosis that used to exist. And suddenly, more and more young girls in Salem began to show these symptoms. Fingers were pointed to Tituba, the minister's slave, Sarah Good, a beggar, and Sarah Osborne, a widower. While the Sarahs claimed innocence, Tituba confessed to being a witch and claimed there were more in town. But this was after days of interrogation, and probably because she thought that she would gain leniency. She didn't. More women were called into question, including Martha Corey, a regular churchgoer who was like, hey, this all seems kinda sketchy. Sadly, being anti-witch trial meant being pro-witch. Now, this broke the floodgates, as it meant that anyone could be a witch, even the good people, not just the poor and the outcast, so no one was safe. Reverends, children, men, and women began to populate the town jail. And with this flood of allegations, the governor of Massachusetts established the court of Oyer and Terminer, or the court to hear and to determine. One tool used to identify witchcraft was a witch cake, which is just a desecration of cake. It was made of rye flour and the urine of the bewitched person, which was then fed to a dog who, if they had the same symptoms, witchcraft, which would be hilarious if it wasn't used as an excuse to kill people. Another form of evidence was spectral evidence, which meant what people saw in their dreams were considered true. Even Cotton Mather, the dude who helped start this entire fear campaign, was like,
do not lay more stress upon pure spectre testimony than it will bear. It is very certain that the devils have sometimes represented the shapes of person, not only innocent, but very virtuous.
In other words, whoa, too far. And it went far. While the trial slowed to a halt by May 1693, the damage was done. 19 people had been hanged, 1 pressed to death, and several more died in jail. All in 1 year, in one little town. So what could have caused this? Putting aside any belief in that these people were actually witches, Linnda Caporael has come up with the most popular theory, ergot, which contains the primary ingredient of LSD. So ergot is a parasitic fungus that blossoms into large blackened grains on grass plants, including rye. Now, farmers were aware of its existence. They called it cockspur, but they didn't know it was bad. They just figured it was grains that had been cooked in the sun, not a poison. A poison which, when consumed, can result in convulsions, hallucinations, and painful contractions of the muscles. Sounds like a good explanation for those bewitchment symptoms. But how did they ingest it? Well, Salem's primary grain was rye, a common target of ergot, and in 1691, a rainy, warm growing season promoted heavier fungus infestations for grain to be consumed in 1692. That was when the first victims began to appear, but in 1692, there was a drought, which likely killed out all of the ergot, which explains why the trial slowed to a halt by 1693. And if this is true, it wouldn't be the first time a plague was caused by ergot. In 857 AD, a disease known as St. Anthony's Fire plagued Germany, causing people to suffer from tremors and hallucinations. In fact, a lot of possessed behavior can be ascribed to ergotism. It's a pretty good reason, imperfect only because why would it only affect girls? So others say it may have been fraud, just young women bored of small town life seeking some excitement in lies, or being forced to lie to push their family's greater agenda in the town's pre-existing rivalries. But it is important to remember that the illness was just a catalyst for the trials. The original victims, Tituba, Sarah Good, Sarah Osborne, were not suffering from ergotism. They were suffering from prejudice. Prejudice against the poor, the unwanted, the alien, and witchcraft was just a catch-all blame. And we can write off the Salem Witch Trials as one freakish overreaction caused by drugs, or we can recognize that it only could have happened with an unchecked government and prejudice allowed to run free. So that was just some cool history on the Salem Witch Trials. Now, what about you guys? There are other theories as to what caused the trials, from mass hysteria to fraud. So what do you think happened? Tell me down below. If you thought this video was interesting or you just want to support the show, liking and sharing would help out so much. But either way, have a lovely day. Was this a political video? Who knows? I've also included links to Linnda Caporael's actual report on the whole ergotism thing because it's interesting. Also, shout out to JSTOR!